Well, good morning, everybody. It's early here at Little Portion Hermitage. I get up way before dawn. I know some of you do too. And we traveled all day yesterday, coming back from our ministry down in Texas. And consequently, we missed a little reflection on the feast of St. Jerome yesterday. And I want to add it. It's a day late, $1 short, I know, but I want to add St. Jerome. So St. Jerome was a huge contributor to the early church. He gave us the Vulgate Bible, or the Bible in the vulgar tongue, which would have been what? Latin. Latin was used in the early Western church because it was the language of the people. The liturgy was in Latin so that they could understand it, and they translated the Bible into Latin so that the people could understand it, Originally, he was going to transfer the Septuagint, which was Greek, into Latin, and then he got to be friends with some rabbis, and he went ahead and went all the way back to the Hebrew in the Old Testament and translated that into Latin. And that's how we get our Vulgate today. It was a big moment of debate between Jerome and St. Augustine, because St. Augustine said, no, don't go back to the Hebrew, because that's not the language of the Christians. The Christians used the Greek Jewish scriptures, what's called the Septuagint. So you can see it in passages like, and a virgin shall conceive and give birth to a child. That's a direct quote from the Septuagint translation of Isaiah, and that's what's used in the New Testament. But the Hebrew says a young maiden, which implies a virgin, but it's not quite as direct. So Jerome went all the way back to the Hebrew and translated that into the vulgar language, Latin. It's a beautiful language, but it was the vulgar language. Many of the people used Greek, and bishops used Greek for the liturgy, because that was the language of the early church, the earlier church. He's already early church, but the earlier church. And but the people couldn't understand it. And Latin was first used exclusively, ironically, in northern Africa, where the troops went to conquer Carthage from Rome. And then they brought that back into Italy, and they kind of wiped out the remnants of the elite who used Greek, and everything got translated into the language of the people, the vulgar language, the vernacular. So that's how Latin was originally used in the early church. St. Jerome, I've had a chance to go into his cell, and he had a wonderful, wonderful cell in Bethlehem. So there's, when you go to the Church of the Nativity, you'll also find St. Jerome's cell there. And it's a biggish room, but not a very, very big room. And that's the room where he translated all of the scriptures into Latin. And he lived there in Bethlehem in a monastery with a double monastery. There were nuns in one part and monks in the other, and he was living the monastic life in Bethlehem. He had traveled. He'd lived the life of a hermit. He had up in Cappadocia and lived under an elder, and then he went and all the way to Egypt, and he came back and he settled in Bethlehem. He didn't go back to Rome, which he was supposed to do, but he ended up living in Bethlehem. So he's a fascinating guy. Let's see, what else did he do? He translated the life of the first monk, and that would have been St. Paul, not St. Paul the Apostle, but Paul, the friend of St. Anthony of the Desert. And his is the first translation and the first life ever written of Paul the hermit. So Antony and Paul are often seen side by side in the iconography of the early monks, the early desert fathers. and he lived there because he had, he and his brother were fighting over the property, kind of a dispute of the children when their father died. And he said, why am I doing this? And he left, and he never came back. He went into the desert, and he lived in the desert. So if you go to St. Antony's there in Egypt, over in the hills towards the Red Sea, go a little bit further up north, and you're going to find St. Paul of the desert, St. Paul's Monastery, and they're considered sister monasteries because they were brothers in pioneering the first monastic life in Egypt. So St. Jerome gives us that life. So thank you, St. Jerome. He was a little irascible, a little hard to get along with, but sometimes, people, shakers and movers, have a little bit more of a strident attitude or a strident spirit, and that's why they get things done. And St. Jerome was kind of like that. So, wonderful life, got a lot done for the church, and lived the monastic life in Bethlehem, and helped bring the translation of St. Paul of the Desert, or St. Paul the Hermit, to the general public, the same way that St. Athanasius had brought the life of St. Anthony of the Desert to the general public. So thank you, St. Jerome. And let's say together, St. Jerome, pray for us, and we too go out and accomplish great things for the people of God in a way that the people of God can understand. And St. Jerome can be our patron saint in that. So we say, St. Jerome, pray for us.